Hello! Today I wanted to take a look at a classic New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. So the wine I'm looking at is the 2020 vintage of Cloudy Bay from Marlborough in the South Island. And the 2020 vintage still has the older label of this. So Cloudy Bay is probably the best known brand produced by New Zealand's wine industry. And the wine itself has done so much to define not only Marlborough, but also the whole of New Zealand's wines for the world. And these days, it's still the case that over 85% of New Zealand's wine exports are Sauvignon Blanc. And it's fair to say that Cloudy Bay remains a standard bearer for this style of wine. It's a premium priced Sauvignon Blanc, but at a time when there are many New Zealand Sauvignon Blancs available, most of which have lovely crispness, fresh aromatics, notes of tropical fruit, passion fruit, cut grass and gooseberries. Does Cloudy Bay actually still stand out? Is it really still a leading example of this variety? Does it deserve the recognition it gets? And most importantly, is it really worth paying the premium that you pay for Cloudy Bay Sauvignon Blanc? So just to recap on the history of Cloudy Bay as an estate, it was founded in 1985 by an Australian called David Hohnen. He'd already established the successful Cape Mentelle winery in Western Australia, but was quick to see the potential of Marlborough as a wine producing region. Very rapidly invested in vineyards, a winery, and put together an excellent team to make his wines here. Hohnen managed to find people to work for him such as Kevin Judd, who was a long-term winemaker here, was the founder and is still the owner of Greywacke. For instance, the viticulturist working here for most of that period was somebody called Ivan Sutherland, one of the co-founders and co-owners of Dog Point. So the team that established Cloudy Bay have gone on to do so much to build and reinforce the reputation that Marlborough has as a wine-producing region. Now, as well as making Sauvignon Blanc, they make two examples. There's this standard expression, and then there's also an oaked version of Sauvignon Blanc called Te Coco. Cloudy Bay also make a still Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, as well as a white and a rosé sparkling wine in the Pelorus range. Now, it was as early as 1990 that the champagne house Veuve Clicquot stepped in to invest in Cloudy Bay. And the money they brought helped to buy and plant a vineyard, which is now known as the Widow's Block, in honour of the widow Clicquot, Nicole Barbe Ponsedin, who was a key figure in establishing the reputation of Veuve Clicquot as a champagne producer. In fact, she is the person supposed to have invented the process of remuage, to remove the yeast from bottle fermented sparkling wine. In 2003, Veuve Clicquot completed the process of buying out David Hohnen and took full control of the company, bringing it into the Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy stable of brands. Something which really did supercharge the brand's distribution. And you can see that in the fact that today, Cloudy Bay's wine are available to buy in more than 30 countries worldwide. Now, Sauvignon Blanc fruit from which this wine is made comes largely from vineyards on the Wairau Valley Floor in Marlborough. Here, the combination of the cooling influences in the climate and the free-draining riverbed gravel soils are perfect for the growing Sauvignon Blanc. So some of the vineyards that go into this are named as the Estate Vineyard, the Motukawa Vineyard, the aforementioned Widow's Block, the Red Shed Vineyard, and they also mention the Mustang Vineyard. And I was curious to see this because when I did a video fairly recently regarding Cloudy Bay's Pinot Noir, one of the points I made there was that most of the fruit for that came from the southern valleys, and one of those vineyards was the Mustang Vineyard. Now, to be fair, the Southern Valleys vineyards are part of the Wairau Valley, and evidently Mustang is in the Brancott Valley, and you really couldn't be much more at the heart of Marlborough and its Sauvignon Blancs than Brancott. But I would assume that fruit coming from the Mustang vineyard is likely to give a little more weight and richness due to the fact it's likely to have heavier soils than some of the other vineyards I've named. That having said, these are just Cloudy Bay's vineyards, and today Cloudy Bay actually farm 163 different parcels of vines. And each year they're dealing with 65 different grower blocks. Vines are trained, as is fairly normal for the Marlborough region, using vertical shoot positioning, so these are straight up and down hedges, trying to ensure that the actual hedge stays quite narrow, so there's not too much shading of one leaf by another leaf, and as much sunlight as possible is getting through onto the fruit and onto the leaves to ensure that there's reliable photosynthesis going on there. Now, Cloudy Bay are proud of the fact that they were founder members of New Zealand's Sustainable Wine Growing Initiative. And this was an initiative that was first adopted by growers back in 1997. So these practices are well established and have had time to be refined in the vineyards. Cloudy Bay are also currently working with some organic practices in their vineyards in Marlborough, with a view to potentially converting to being fully organic in the near future. Now, they say that the 2020 vintage gave them near perfect conditions for grape growing. The vintage was dry, but it wasn't a particularly hot year in Marlborough, so the fruit could mature quite easily. Water stress didn't restrict ripening at all, and the dry weather was an absolute godsend for the vineyard team. They were able to get into the vines and work to expose the bunches to make sure the fruit had optimum sunlight exposure. And this allowed full flavour development, giving concentrated and complex flavours in the fruit. There was a little rain in December, but fortunately the subsequent period was dry, so there was very little disease pressure in the vineyard. The main complication of the vintage was that in 2020, harvest was completed under conditions of a nationwide lockdown for COVID-19 in New Zealand. Thankfully, winemaking was classified as an essential industry. I can't think how else you would classify it. And so harvest was able to continue. But there were some quite strict guidelines with regarding social separation and with regard to hygiene for the crews. Thankfully, the conditions gave them plenty of time to pick each block at optimum maturity. They weren't rushing to gather in fruit before weather events or anything like that. Sauvignon Blanc harvest ran from the 15th of March through to April the 2nd. And I was a little surprised to find that Sauvignon Blanc was actually the last variety that they finished harvesting. I was assuming the reds would have been picked later than that, but actually they finished picking Pinot Noir on the 1st of April. So not a lot before, but not quite what I'd expected. Obviously prior to that, they'd already picked all their sparkling wine base and the Chardonnay as well. The fruit was machine picked, and this enabled rapid picking in the early morning, in the coolest period of the morning. I would assume with machine pickers working in the dark under spotlights, evidently sort of from about 2-3 o'clock in the morning is the coolest period in a vineyard. So the 2020 vintage of Cloudy Bay Sauvignon Blanc is 100% Sauvignon Blanc, and I think recent vintages have all been pure Sauvignon Blanc. Some of the early vintages were known for containing a small 2 or 3% of Semillon. Evidently, I've learned the 1985 vintage of Cloudy Bay Sauvignon Blanc even contained a little bit of Riesling, something I'd hitherto been unaware of. On arrival at the winery, the grapes were all destemmed, and this was prior to a long, cold pressing. And pressing was allowed to go out over a period of 48 to 72 hours to try and give lovely, clean juice. That juice was then allowed to cold settle and was then racked off any solids prior to inoculation and fermentation. The notes suggest that fermentation was done entirely with selected cultured yeasts, and the majority of the fermentation went at cool temperature in stainless steel tanks. About 4% of the harvest, however, was fermented in oak. They were using a combination of seasoned barriques and larger oak fermenters for that. And the idea of that being to allow the fermentation to go on at a slightly warmer temperature, to add some complexity and also to add some richness of texture. I guess if we're talking about what Cloudy Bay does to stand out from some other producers, I think some of these additional techniques trying to build a little extra complexity, a little bit more weight and richness, and perhaps to make the wines a little more age-worthy are what we're looking at here. I don't believe it was the case in 2020, but looking at notes from more recent vintages, they seem to be moving more towards doing those fermentations that they do in the oaked portion with indigenous yeasts. So again, that should build some extra complexity and a little bit more rounded texture. The notes don't actually say how long the wine stayed in oak for, but this was seasoned oak, so I'm not expecting that it would be much more than about 6 to 9 months maybe. And they make the point that after tasting and selection, there were 91 different lots of wine went into the final blend for 2020 Cloudy Bay Sauvignon Blanc. So let's take a look at it, shall we? First thing to say, a very pale yellow with hints of green there. Swirling it, the wine is labelled as having 13.5% alcohol, but the notes say that actually that's 13.2%. So the aromas, I've been standing here and the aromas have been quite obvious to me, but examining them more closely, you have some real sort of greenish sort of gooseberry, perhaps a hint of cut grass, touches of lime, more raised lime flower notes. And there's a mineral nature, almost a chalkiness, although obviously that's not a soil type that we're talking about here. There's plenty going on in here. As the aromas opened, I saw a little more sort of tropical fruit, tiny touch of passion fruit, and maybe even sort of heading towards a sort of a riper mango note. I guess there are also creamy hints coming from a touch of lees aging. It's a complex and quite powerful nose. So let's see what it tastes like, shall we? The palate seems completely dry. The notes I've got say there's 2.4 grams per litre of sugar in there, which is very low. Now there is a richness and a rounded texture. I mentioned gooseberries earlier, and they've got something of that sort of rounded, rich pectin note that you get with gooseberries, but that's got quite a greenish nature, and that's being followed up by some really quite tart acidity with some malic notes there. But actually the acidity is resolving into more of a sort of a focused mineral sort of style. As it does that, on the mid palate, I'm seeing a little bit more of that sort of passion fruit sort of nature. There are perhaps notes of blackcurrant leaf, lime flower, lime. This is a wine whose mineral crispness seems to be keeping it more towards the focused, piquant, green fruit end of the spectrum. There aren't really sort of rich, powerful mango notes coming through here. That fresh, mouth-watering acidity is providing lovely, well-defined mineral length that's lasting very well. Wine is probably of at least medium body. I was talking about the textured, rounded sort of pectin, gooseberry sort of note on the attack, and that's following through to the mid-palate. The alcohol seems in balance. It's not making the finish hot or fat, and it's allowing the aromas to carry on through to the end. I think very often people approach Sauvignon Blanc as a wine for drinking the youngest available, and under normal circumstances I would agree with them totally. However, I frequently find myself tasting Cloudy Bay that little bit older. I've been suggested the ideal drinking window for this is out to 2026, so this should really be drinking its optimum at the moment. And frankly, it still seems really young, fresh and pure, so there are reasonable chances that it's going to carry on drinking for more than a year or so. So do I think that Cloudy Bay is still New Zealand's preeminent Sauvignon Blanc? Certainly there are challengers for that crown. I've already mentioned Greywacke and Dog Point, so to an extent that's a matter of opinion. As to the question, is this a premium example of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc? To my mind, that's undoubtedly the case. There's a richness and a concentration and a focus here. A lovely fine seam of mineral acidity really does enliven it and turns it into really quite a classy wine. And actually, looking at the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score, this wine gets 91 out of 100, which I think is a reasonably fair score, but I might perhaps myself have gone to 92 on this. I think this wine has some aspects that take it up a touch into the realms of fine wine and really is delivering some excellent drinking. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, do please press the like button. I would really appreciate that. If you're watching these videos and you haven't subscribed yet, I'd really appreciate it if you'd give it some thought and perhaps click on that button as well. And if you do remember to set yourself an alert so you can be notified every time I publish a new tasting. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the videos, do feel free to pass them on to them as well. If you have any comments, please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to hear what you think about the wines I'm looking at, the tastings I'm doing, or anything else that relates to that. I will of course leave a link in the box below to the Wine Searcher webpage for this vintage of this wine, so that you can see if it's available near you, and if so, at what price. And do also have a look at the information that's contained on those pages, because there's a lot of useful background information about the wine's history, its winemaking and its pricing there. So thank you once again for joining me. And I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time and come and join me for another tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.